Hey everybody, welcome back for another one. This time we're going to be talking about more nations, more problems. So we looked at decolonization and we started to think about the way people in South Asia, people in Southeast Asia, Africa, started to break away from colonial empires, form their own states, have revolutions, insurrections, whatever you want to call them, and start to establish their own senses of nationalism or their own place in the world. But as that kind of moves forward, what happens? Did decolonization lead to bigger and better things for everybody, or did the same sorts of systems set up and repeat themselves in slightly different ways? So decolonization, as we saw before, pretty much ended formal empire around the world. There's a lot of empire that still exists, sort of informally or sort of under the radar. Anything ranging from the U.S. control of Puerto Rico to French control of some islands in the South Pacific. There's all kinds of things you could point to, but basically that system is no longer valid. The sort of broader global system of colonization and direct imperialism. People living in post-colonial societies, though, continue to sort of struggle with the legacy of colonialism, and it isn't entirely clear that the processes of decolonization were even or helped everybody. There's all these new sort of social and political models, new economic models that aren't always beneficial. And so we'll look at how these new societies, these new nations tried to make the best of what they were given or could take, and how that sort of shaped out in terms of the way a lot of the map looks, today. So first we'll talk about some post-colonial political models, what sort of states formed in the aftermath of decolonization up until today. Then we'll look at different economic models, how the sort of post-colonial states economies succeeded or didn't, what people tried. Different places are going to try different models, ranging from very sort of pro-communist approaches to liberal economic policies to their own versions of socialism or whatever. There's a lot of different stuff people try. Then we'll sort of look at where post-colonialism might be going today. What does it look like now? Have these problems been solved? Did they work? So after struggling against empire, after breaking away, sometimes very violently, sometimes peacefully, all of these new independent nations are going to continue to experiment. Having been under the heel of Britain or France or the United States or whoever for so long, nationalism and general sort of social and cultural policies, particularly ones that were by the state, had a particular flavor to them that most people didn't want anymore. They wanted to innovate and create their own way of doing things. So one way that sort of was new was China's communist model. So we looked at this before. We saw during World War II, right? There's sort of a civil war going on in China as well. At the end of it, the communists win. And here you have Mao Zedong, who was the chairman of the Communist Party in China, pronouncing that communist China exists. So first of all, communism is not a government model, it's an economic model. But let's not worry about that for the moment. That's for your economics class. Let's just ignore it. Because in a sort of practical application in both the Soviet Union and in communist China, it was a government model as well. So, or that is to say, a particular type of authoritarian government developed alongside it. So this happens in 1949. Mao declares the People's Republic of China a new communist state. But what does that look like? We kind of know a little bit about what the Soviet Union looks like, but communism in China had to be different. When you think of communism or the early developments of it, you might think Marx, you might think of the working class, factories, stuff like this. But the problem was there wasn't a big working class in China. There weren't a lot of factories. So that classic proletariat, these people who were crushed by the industry, right? People who worked in the factories and toiled with machines and stuff like this, didn't exist, and not to any large scale in China. So Mao reinterprets this model And he says, actually, it's the working class peasants that are the exploited class. All of those rice farmers out in the field, they're the ones that are actually the proletariat. They're the ones that are oppressed by landlords, by government, by other sort of wealthier folks, right? So he hopes to develop this sort of new communist model where everything is redistributed, land is redistributed, agriculture is collectivized, all these sorts of things. But the main goal is for society to become pretty even, even as possible in terms of what people have or have access to, and also to make China a powerful world entity. So remember, China had a revolution in 1912. They ended the Qing dynasty and became, for a brief time anyway, a sort of liberal democracy. Liberal democracy seems to have sort of failed in China, as it does in lots of places, actually. So communism is stepping in to say, okay, those things didn't work, let's try something else. And Mao's way of doing this is going to become a sort of model for Asian communism in places like Vietnam or Laos or North Korea to an extent, although all of those places don't necessarily get along with China. So it serves as sort of a guidepost anyway, in terms of what communism is going to look like in East and Southeast Asia. So what did they actually do? What were some of Mao's policies? What did they attempt? How did they try to make China a great state? Well, one of the early policies was called the Great Leap Forward. So the basic idea was Mao wanted to transform China from a large nation that produced lots of agricultural goods to a industrial society, and he hoped to do it in just a few years. Just radically transform the countryside. Instead of paddy fields and pigs, he wanted steel mills and a modern navy and all these sorts of things. So how do you do that? Well, he envisioned collectivizing everything. The sort of whole agricultural process could be collectivized, meaning farmers would lose their land. They wouldn't have a particular right to it in terms of property ownership, and then it would be farmed by the community, and all of the resources of that community theoretically would be pooled, and the government would be able to then redistribute resources to everybody in need and use the extra to manufacture the state. But it did not go well. One thing farmers hate is collectivized agriculture. There's issues of incentives, right? Why work really hard if everybody is getting the same amount? Although that issue is often overplayed in American sort of versions of communism. But also, the goal itself was ridiculous. You can't take people who for countless generations have grown wheat and suddenly tell them, no, next year you're going to produce, the best steel in the world. It doesn't work that way. In other places like Japan that modernized incredibly quickly, it was still, 30, 50 years. Mao tried to do it in a couple years, and one of the main results was a massive famine. Everybody sort of had a set of quotas for the amount they were supposed to produce. Nobody really wanted to get in trouble, so everybody lied about the amounts they were producing to make sure they hit those quotas. But this led the government to overestimate the amount they were producing or could redistribute, and food became scarce. Then the government didn't really make any plans to deal with that because on paper, the food wasn't scarce, right? And those resources were being redirected towards new Cold War agendas, making missiles, trying to get the atomic bomb, right? Mao didn't get that for a while, other things like that. So it's a terrible famine that results. And coming out of the Great Leap Forward, maybe 20 to 45 million people die. So more Chinese died during this program than during World War II, which is absolutely incredible in terms of the human cost to the Chinese. So that settles down, and another generation of young people come up. These little red books they're waving are all sayings of the chairman Mao. He writes extensively on communism and how to have a nice orderly society. So in the mid-60s, 1960s, there was a whole group of young Chinese folks that were like 12 to 20 who had learned about revolution kind of nonstop and communism nonstop, but they had never been able to sort of participate, to be part of it in the way they wanted. And there was this growing sort of youth movement to actively engage in revolution. Mao was getting kind of in trouble with the state. He was the leader of the state, but there were other people that kind of were trying to come up. And so Mao capitalizes on these young group of people who want to prove themselves like the most loyal, and he gets a sort of cult of personality where these people just worship Mao. Mao is this amazing entity to them who saved China, who modernized China. He's the reason it's sunny. He's the reason it rains when you need rain. Um, and these young people began to engage in some violent activity. They wanted to basically have their own sense of revolution. Along with this was the sense that what was holding China back was its clinging to the old past, clinging to old traditions. And these old traditions, old religions, old customs were making Chinese people not modern, not advanced, stuff like this. So part of the Cultural Revolution was about destroying all of these bad olds that had been preventing China from becoming fully modern. So all around the country, these young people start to do things like raid temples and burn Buddhist statues. Because why do you need statues of the Buddha, right? This isn't modern, this is backwards, they were arguing. Or they would try to find like someone maybe had studied French literature in France, they were an intellectual, and now they were back in China, they were teaching. You could sniff him out and say he's not a real revolutionary, he's really attached to like Western ideas, and hence he's part of that like old hero worship of the West that we need to get rid of. So maybe we'll burn all of his books and embarrass him. This affects hundreds of millions of people. There's a couple million deaths. In the end, it becomes almost like a miniature war between these different factions of youth that are really like 12, 14, 18, that are all sort of trying to show how revolutionary they are and how much they can change the future. And it leads towards just incredible amounts of destructive practices. People that are deemed not revolutionary enough are sent out to the countryside to live with peasants so they can learn to sort of, embrace the true sort of peasant nature, right? But at the same time, you also want to be hyper modern, so it's really tricky. Both of these programs, from today's perspective, are seen as these really sort of grotesque failures and manipulative sort of exploits from the Chinese government to take pressure off of Mao or to like encourage the population to engage in their policies. But for a lot of these young people, they also felt like they were part of a real social and cultural revolution. They happily engaged in these things. They wanted to, save China. They wanted to make China modern. They wanted to be proud of their country. And so they were engaging in these activities, trying to do exactly that. But the Cultural Revolution is going to come to an end in the late 1970s when Mao Zedong dies. When he dies, the Cultural Revolution is over. There's no more sort of mechanical action for it to work. There's no one at the top demanding it continue. So eventually, after little power struggles, Mao was never really blamed for any of the problems, but his wife and like his three closest associates were the Gang of Four. But someone does manage to come to power, Deng Xiaoping. Here he is. He becomes the new ruler of China. It's communist China, and he makes a really interesting move. Basically, from this point on, China will no longer be communist in its economic model. So that idea of collectivized agriculture, sometimes not being allowed to have money or engage in market economies, is over. For all intents and purposes, from 1980, China is a capitalist society again in terms of economics, or it's going that direction. But Deng Xiaoping keeps the same authoritarian state that was there under Mao. So China is currently a communist country, but only in terms of the government structure, the authoritarian government structure they developed under Mao. It has nothing to do with communism, nothing to do with Marx, nothing to do with the Soviet Union. It's just an authoritarian state based on the models that were developed during the communist era. And so Deng Xiaoping is going to allow free markets, he's going to allow foreign investment to a point, and he makes a really interesting argument. He says, it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. He doesn't care what you call the economy. You want to call it socialism, communism, a liberal market-based economy, who cares? As long as the state makes money, as long as you can feed the people, as long as people are relatively happy, that's fine. But all of these market reforms come with other ideas. Whenever you have massive sort of intellectual reforms of politics or economics or culture, you tend to get other movements associated with that. So as these new policies are opening up and people are engaging in market economies, they're allowed to know a little bit more about the outside world. A lot of young people in a sort of new revolutionary wave demand a sort of liberal democratic government. They say, look, Mao's dead, the Cultural Revolution is over, we've gone back to a market-based economy. Let's end this sort of authoritarian state. Let's do things like have elections, let's talk democracy, let's talk about votes, all these sorts of things. But that's not very popular with the authoritarian government. So by the late 80s, this has really come to a head. Thousands of students, tens of thousands of students, march into Beijing, into Tiananmen Square, which is shown here, totally full of people. It's a giant, giant, broad, opened area used for like military parades and all these sorts of things. And they protest. They want not only to continue the sort of opening up of the free market, but they want true and genuine democracy. The Chinese state, though, doesn't want that. So the Chinese government sends in troops and police to sort of calm people down, to keep it cool. But in reality, they kind of flip. The Chinese government, to an extent, is like humoring all these students, thinking it'll kind of go away, but it starts to snowball on them, and they decide to get rid of these students, to disperse it. So the Chinese government sends in the military to get rid of these students. This is a very famous photo of this guy called Tank Man. People don't know who he really is. These tanks were going to roll into that square filled with students to disperse them and end this sort of uprising. This guy just was walking through, saw it coming, stood in the way. He looks kind of like a teacher. A lot of people have argued maybe he's from the university nearby or something. And the tank kind of rolls up and just stops. There's like some young kid in the army driving this tank, and he doesn't want to necessarily just run over this guy. So it kind of like starts to creep to the side, and the guy just kind of like steps in front of it. These tanks get slowed down for kind of a long time until this guy is just like, forget you, and gets out of there. Meanwhile, a bunch of students get out of the square, but not everybody. The Chinese army goes in, and it's an absolute massacre. They try to disperse these people. They don't want to leave. In the end, tons of people get killed by the Chinese government, maybe 10,000 students. There's no real records. There's no real official counts. It's only what was recorded. In fact, if you try to Google this in China today, you get nothing. Officially in China, this whole thing doesn't exist. You can't find it on the internet, right? Because the Chinese government controls the internet, people see. And lots of Chinese young people just don't believe it happened, even though there are plenty of photographs of it and stuff like that. So this was the end, for a while anyway, to sort of popular democratic movements in China. So a reform was possible. They reformed the economy. So it's totally possible to grow up in China and have a very nice middle-class life, make good money, but not necessarily to engage in liberal democracy. Those two things are still quite separate. Another example we might look at when we talk about states after decolonization is Iran. Remember we talked about this before, this guy Mohammed Mogaddesh, who's was elected prime minister, right? There he is. He wanted to modernize Iran, nationalize the oil industry after he found out the British and the Americans were kind of, stealing Iranian oil essentially. And we saw that the British and U.S. agents, I think James Bond type agents, orchestrated a coup so that he would get thrown out. He was democratically elected, and then this guy was placed into power by a king. Shah just basically means king, who was friendly to the United States and would continue to sell oil at a discount, essentially, to the British and the Americans. So this attempt at decolonization really failed, but right under the surface, there was a lot of anger and tension, and people didn't just forget about it. So over the 50s, 60s, 70s, the Shah comes to be seen as more and more corrupt, more and more a puppet of the United States. And by late 1970s, this boils over into a broad group of Iranians who oppose the Shah. This was not an Islamic revolution. After the fact, it's going to get called an Islamic revolution, but in the beginning, it was not. There were women, there were workers. It was very secular in nature. A lot of people, it was an anti-imperialist revolution that wanted to get rid of the Shah, who was seen as a sort of puppet for the United States. Shah is the US puppet, down with the Shah, right? So this revolutionary sentiment starts to sort of spill over into the streets. People are demanding new leadership, and it becomes an open revolution. People are, the Shah is deploying military forces to put down protesters. Protesters likewise are sort of continuously engaging in efforts to kind of get rid of his government. And in the end, the Shah escapes to Egypt with the help of the United States, and the government collapses. So in the wake of that, people celebrate, people cheer, people are happy, the Shah is gone. But this was like a broad coalition against him, so now who's going to lead it? Was it these people that fought for it? Maybe not. In the end, it's this guy, Khomeini, right? Ayatollah Khomeini, who's going to sort of co-opt the revolution. After the fact, this one particular group of pretty extremist Muslims are going to claim that they had been the real revolutionaries all along, they had got rid of the Shah, all this sort of stuff. It absolutely wasn't true. But once the revolution is over, a lot of people are just happy it's over. They were like, oh, cool, new government, let's get moving, let's do something else. There was also factional infighting, basically a civil war between these revolutionary parties, and this sort of Islamic state came out on top. But there was a problem. So this group of conservative Muslims that wanted political power came into power and declared an Islamic nation state. But no such thing had ever existed. Remember, nation states are relatively new, so this is sort of a new twist on it. You're going to have a Muslim nation state. So what did they do? Was it totally different? Not really. The very first thing they did was make a constitution and promulgate, the rights and responsibilities of citizens, just like a modern nation state would. But they have provisions for religious leadership, and that sort of denies certain aspects of democracy. If you're a minority religious member, for example, that might be a problem. They also painstakingly rewrite the history and recharacterize the whole revolution as this sort of a particular type of Islamic movement against the Shah. And while it is true that that had been a sort of fraction of the revolution, everybody else is pushed to the side. The Constitution also made it so that the leaders of the government would always be from this particular Islamic sect, and there was a sort of overall anti-American feel to the whole thing. Many of these leaders felt like Americans were anti-Muslim, or they had repressed Islam, or they had imperialized Iran by getting rid of Iran's democracy early on and putting in the Shah. And in a lot of ways, they were right. But there were a lot of problems. What do you do with all of these people that were, say, revolutionary women who had helped have the revolution, who had fought for the revolution, who had fought against the Shah, but weren't from this conservative Muslim sect? A lot of these women didn't wear hijab or any head covering. They liked Western clothes. They liked liberal democracy. They were just starting to like rock and roll and punk music even. All this sort of stuff. What do you do with even younger ones, right? Who had envisioned Iran as like a new modern nation state. They wanted to be like Britain and France and the United States. They wanted to vote. They wanted democracy, or actually a lot of them wanted communism, right? Modeled on the Soviet Union, not on Maoist China. So unfortunately, for the purposes of the Islamic State, all of these people have to go, and you have to repress these movements. But these were the very movements that led the revolution originally anyway. So a very, very difficult time. These people who thought they were sort of part of the revolution all of a sudden get sidelined, right? So you can look at China, communism in China, you can look at a sort of religious state in Iran, but the main sort of political model for the decolonizing world is going to become something like a military government. Um, a sort of dictatorship model. So one of the main forms of government around the world still is just good old-fashioned military dictatorship. A general or an admiral or a field marshal or whatever comes to power, and they stay in power. And often they write into constitutions because you want, at least to look like you have a nation state that's based on something, that they're just in charge. So places like Burma, Ghana, Argentina, Libya, Fiji, Pakistan, Thailand right now, right, is run by, essentially run by a military government. So in some ways, military governments are good. They can do some good stuff. They're really great at throwing out a bad government. So if there is an authoritarian, if there is another dictator, if there's something really, really wrong, military governments are really good at overthrowing those people and kicking them out because they have the guns. You know what I mean? But they can also end wars, right? They can also weed out corruption pretty quickly. However, they're not made for the long term. If you have a military government, citizens within the government don't get representation unless they're in the military, and even then, not normally. So the modern nation state, remember, has to do with like popular sovereignty, this idea that like the nation works for the people. But if you have a military government or a dictatorship, all of a sudden it becomes so easy for the whole government to seem like it's working for itself or for the rulers. So military governments tend to sort of rot from the inside because people don't like being under this sort of government and they actively resist. So in order to make it work, you have to continually sort of repress your own people at a low level. And that model just long term is never really sustainable. But nevertheless, it's the most common model, arguably, sort of around the world. And lots of times communist states or liberal democratic states fail, or at least don't thrive. And that's when military governments come in, like Ghana, right? We looked at was one of the early decolonizing nations that was this huge inspiration for the rest of Africa. But they themselves are overthrown. Nkrumah is overthrown, right, by a military government. So it can happen sort of anywhere, and can last for quite a long time. It often takes people quite a while to amass the sort of political sort of gravity or momentum to break away from such a government. So along with these different sort of political models, there's different economic models that people try to deal with, or different economic situations people try to deal with. Remember, we looked at communism more as sort of a political structure, the authoritarian sort of model. But there's all kinds of different ways that these countries try to engage with the world economy. Under colonialism, right, these countries are sort of part of a commodity chain that was exploited by the metropole. But once they're independent, that all changes, right? So you can look towards places like India again and think about the Green Revolution that happened there, and this sort of turn towards agro-capitalism. So India's economy improved a lot after decolonization, in that when they were colonized by the British, basically everything was extracted. The whole point of having an economy in India, from the perspective of the British, was to build really nice houses back in London and make the British militarily strong and all that sort of stuff. So when India becomes independent, all of those resources and applications that had been driving India were all of a sudden not pulling away just to Britain or even primarily outside of India, but sort of refreshed inside the nation. Along with this is the sort of green revolution. So we talked about this a little bit when we talked about the sort of environmental history of the 20th century, but the green revolution is huge in India. It is in China and the United States as well. This is, remember, the use of artificial pesticides, fertilizers, all kinds of different technologies to maximize yields. So you see these kids out there spraying some sort of pesticide. They should probably be wearing a mask, but hey, you know. Anyway, so what that did was just blew the roof off of the amount of food that India could produce. And most of that food was for the export economy. So India could grow a tremendous amount of wheat, a tremendous amount of rice, and then they sold those things to Europe, to Japan, to the United States, to Canada, and took that money to reinvest in itself a little bit. Some of it was in heavy industry, right? So India is able to take some of that money that they get back and build factories and stuff like that, but mostly it goes towards a general sort of slow raise in the quality of life for people in India. However, many of the people actually doing farming became poorer during the Green Revolution. And if you've taken a US history class, this is very similar to what happens after the freedom of the slaves in the United States or Reconstruction, where people get locked into sort of tenant farming and the sort of what it was called, the sort of crop share, crop lien sort of systems where people would basically take out loans so they could buy all this stuff. If you were a farmer, you wanted all this artificial pesticide and fertilizer and all that sort of stuff, new machines like tractors, because it could really increase your yield. But in order to get those things, you had to take out loans. So if you have a good year, no problem. You pay back your loans, you have a little extra, and that's how you send your kids to school, or that's how you repair your house, or whatever. But if you have a bad year, you already took out the loan, so you got to pay it back. And if you don't have any left over, you just don't have any left over. You got to take out a new loan. Or if you don't pay the loan back all the way, you have just loan from last year, right? And it kind of builds on top of itself. So although the Green Revolution really led to tons of new food production for the rest of the world in India, it didn't necessarily lead to better lives for all of the farmers. There's a kind of tricky situation here. India's middle class definitely improved. But farming life it's more questionable, right? And more of a slower process. Well, another sort of option, you might look at Latin America and what happened there in the 60s and 70s. So in the 60s and 70s in Latin America, there was this really popular idea called dependency theory. And basically, Latin American intellectuals, philosophers, government, think tanks, states started to really like this concept that in a sort of global economy, you have core areas and you have periphery areas. So the core, kind of like you can see in this chart, is like industrial centers, the place that make cars, televisions, battle cruisers, steel, right? the United States, the UK, France, stuff like that, Japan. And then you have all of the peripheral nations, Costa Rica, Argentina, right? Places that weren't doing that sort of heavy manufacturing, heavy industrialization, but they provided the resources to do it. It's like today, Bolivia, right, provides, and Peru provides all kinds of special metals that are brought to the US that are then turned into batteries that are made into Tesla cars, something like that. So these periphery nations are all on the outside, providing a bunch of food and raw materials to these industrial centers that then crank out industrial products. Cool. But food and raw material is not necessarily a great deal in exchange for industrial goods, because if you're a Latin American country, you might produce a lot of food, but the price you're going to get for potatoes or wheat is pretty small. Those things are pretty cheap. And you sell those things to industrialized countries, which allows them to focus on making cars. But say then you want a car in Brazil or Argentina or Mexico. You have to buy it from Ford, and it's going to be really expensive. So these sorts of products of industrialization you got to buy, they're really expensive, but you might not get much money for the stuff that you sell that enables that process. So people theorized that if you were a peripheral nation, you were always going to sort of be poor in relationship to these industrial centers, because there's sort of value added, right, to these goods. So here's a funny depiction of that, right? People paying money for your llama. Cool, you know, that llama is willing to take the cash, but if this lady sells her llama, then all of a sudden next year she might be in trouble. So what Latin American countries tried to do about it was this idea called import substitution industrialization, which I know is kind of a mouthful. So people looked around Mexico and they said, look, man, why are we buying all these cars from the United States? We keep selling them corn and oil and all kinds of other products. We provide labor, but then we have to buy their expensive industrial products. What if we made cars in Mexico? What if we cut out that middleman? Then instead of selling those things to the United States so they could make cars, we could sell those things right here in Mexico so that we could buy cars made right here in Mexico. So Mexicans working in the factories would make that money and not Americans working in the factories, right? So it was a way to sort of break the cycle. But it's really, really hard to do when you think about it. So say you want to make a factory that makes cars. What do you need first? Well, you need a bunch of steel, right, to build the beams that make the factory. Or you need cement factories to make the cement that lays the thing. Or you need factories that produce electricity, right, to run this factory that makes the car. Okay, cool. So let's make a factory that makes electricity. Well, what do we need to do? Well, we need a lot of steel. Okay, so let's make a factory that makes steel. What do we need for that? Well, we need electricity and we need, you know, all this. So it's a really sort of big problem. Industrialization in Europe and the United States developed over 150 years or so, right? So these industries developed sort of part and parcel with the advances in technology and economic advances. And in Latin America, those things weren't always necessarily there. So you can't just be like, okay, cool, let's stop growing corn, let's start making cars. It's somewhat similar to what, you know, Mao had tried to do with the Great Leap, but at sort of a way slower and more rational speed. To an extent, it worked in that, you know, Mexico does make steel, obviously, but it does buy a lot from other places as well, like the US and Germany and Japan. So they weren't really totally able to break these cycles. And a lot of Latin American countries are still find themselves in these sorts of situations where they provide raw material, they provide food, they provide labor, but then ultimately they have to buy all of their industrial products from the West, from China now more and more. So that sort of idea of breaking that cycle didn't necessarily work out. Another just like totally out there idea that's easiest to demonstrate by North Korea, although there's lots of countries that have tried this, is just to try to completely separate from the world economy. So yeah, again, North Korea is not the only place to do this. It's just you guys have probably heard about it, so it's a little bit easier to talk about. There was this idea, you know, North Korea was communist. They had this idea of self-sufficiency. Also, the UN was denying them a lot of sort of global access anyway. And they had this extremely tight repressive government that was denying citizens sort of global access anyway. So the idea is just to sort of separate from the global economy. Can you make an economy inside North Korea that just totally runs itself, that doesn't need outside help? Well, it sounds impossible. In modern economics, modern sort of globalization, there is so much exchange and connection of commodities and markets that just trying to completely pull out of the world economy doesn't really make sense. And in fact, North Korea trades a lot with China and Russia, and even some with South Korea and Japan. Not too much, mostly China and Russia, and is engaged in the world economy in a sense. On the other hand, they seem to have separated themselves out to a large extent from the rest of the world. They make, their own clothes. They make stuff for export to China, of course. But you can't really go to North Korea if you're a regular citizen and buy like a Ford. It's impossible. It's unthinkable. Because those cars don't necessarily exist there, right? It's not tied into these sorts of global markets. And there's a big sort of romanticization of this. Here you go, here's the most recent Kim. He's checking out cookies in the cookie factory, kind of showing North Koreans producing their own biscuits here. That's great, right? So this is for propaganda purposes. It's to show to the world that they're doing great. It's to show to North Koreans like it's working. But the average North Korean can't afford these cookies. They don't get these things. So there's mass starvation, right, inside of North Korea. So a lot of this has to do with power for the state. By separating off from the world economy, the state itself is much more powerful. The Kim family has now, this is the third generation, right, of authoritarian rule for the Kim family. And by keeping people off the internet, by keeping people engaged in certain types of activity within Korea, they're not developing this sort of, and certainly not a sort of Western ideas of liberal democracy, but also they're having trouble breaking away from the sort of authoritarian regime itself. So we've looked at some different political models, we've looked at some different economic models. Okay, so is decolonization over? What does a post-colonial world look like, or where is it sort of leading to? Now that we don't really have these formal empires, yeah, during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union still wrestled over these areas and tried to, direct them into the American camp or the Soviet camp, but that's kind of done now too. So where is this going? Where is it kind of leading us? Are these groups and people headed in a particular direction, or is everybody kind of going their own way? So there's a whole school of thought about these sorts of things. Post-colonial thought, it's also tied to critical theory, which is something you might hear about if you study in sociology or something like this. Basically, the idea is of post-colonial thought in general and critical theory is people should reassess the sort of whole politics of knowledge as a step towards decolonization. Okay, that sounds weird, right? Politics of knowledge, I don't even know what that means. First, it kind of means think about how knowledge is created, how it was created, who controlled it, who distributed it, and why. Then think about the sort of different benefits and processes that are going on for that knowledge, who benefits from people thinking a certain way, and then take some sort of action to change that. Okay, so what does that mean really? So for example, if you're in India right now, colonization has been over for almost 75 years. But most people in India still think having whiter skin is better. They just do. That's a leftover from colonization. So what this would say is we need to examine why we think that, why that's still around. If you go to certain parts of the Caribbean and you speak English, all of a sudden you're just like better than other people who speak French or who don't speak English or French, speak a different language. Um, and the idea is you're somehow probably wealthier or more connected or more educated. But why should that be? Why are people who speak English more educated or thought that way? A lot of Americans grow up speaking English and they're not educated at all. So there's a lot of these sorts of assumptions that are just left over from colonization. Um, the way we think about Native Americans, right, has everything to do with the way colonization unfolded in the United States. So, okay, so now these things are over. How should we change our thinking? Well, to continue with the theme in India, for example, you might look at the work of Arundhati Roy. She's a sort of anti-globalization thinker and writer. She's most famous probably for publishing this book called God of Small Things, which was about India and about decolonization a little bit and sort of Indian identity. But what she argues is you still need to work on anti-imperialism and sort of resisting the pressures of globalization. It's not just enough that there's no formal empire anymore. We need to continue to think about these things. And her arguments are maybe we should not have just brought in all this stuff that we saw as modern, right? When we constructed a modern Indian state, she says we just brought everything that was British or everything that was American, everything that seemed cool at the time. So speaking English and certain economic practices and such. But those were the same practices and the same people who had been colonizers, who had created imperialism in the first place. So to move towards more global justice, or to move towards a sort of alternative future that wasn't still so heavy-handed and so affected by globalization, we might want to sort of just reanalyze where that stuff came from and look for other solutions. In particular, she argues that the sort of forcing globalization on people, as if like if everybody spoke English and ate McDonald's, like somehow it would be a better world. Well, that's just not true. That somehow this sort of forced globalization has taken away a lot of freedoms that decolonization was about in the first place. So if everybody in Nigeria feels like they have to wear Nikes to be cool, that's a problem, she would say. What about local culture? Why does it have to be Nikes? Because when you buy Nikes, people in America make a lot of money, right? And Nike, this American company, makes money. So if you're convinced in Nigeria that that makes you cool, then you buy into it and you spend local money to be cool in this like global system that you imagine is somehow bound to whiteness or economic success or something. You're sort of denying the fundamental principles anyway. And this isn't some weird academic thing. This isn't just coming out of nowhere. Actually, you'd be surprised. A lot of these ideas are already hanging around in places you know. I'll play a clip of a song for you for a second, then we can talk about it that sort of sums up some of these ideas.
Yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. Have no fear for atomic energy, 'cause none of them can stop the time. How long shall they kill our prophets while we stand aside and look? Some say it's just a part of it. We've got to fulfill the book.
Okay, so I cut it off before the sweet guitar solo, but you get the point. If you think that sitting around listening to Bob Marley is just about getting high and hanging out, okay, yeah, that's fun too. But the lyrics for sure are about these issues, this sort of post-colonial thought, right? You're the only one that can free your mind. So cool. We said colonization is over. We told people you are free, but there's all this baggage left. Um, Baggage about color, baggage about race, baggage about language, um, wealth, access, gender that comes from imperial systems, comes from when people were colonized. And it's not just in the minds of people that were colonized, it's in the minds of people who did the colonizing as well. And we have to actively sort of undo this damage. We have to not be scared by looking inward and thinking about this stuff. So, did decolonization work? Has it been worth it? These are pretty interesting questions. Are we going to get, now that there's no Cold War, are we going to get something else? Is it going to be China and the United States competing over people? Is it going to be some other political or religious sort of ideology that people in these different sections of the world sort of compete over? Or are people going to become just more and more globalized until culture is kind of all the same thing? Really, the question is, how are we going to divide the world after empire, right? Because previously we divided it through colonization, and you had sort of colonized and colonizer. Now that doesn't work. There's something different that needs to happen. And a lot of people argue that we need to sort of bear in mind that the leftovers from imperialism are still here. They might be getting in the way of your freedom and might be building a future that's in some ways less free than we kind of imagine. But we'll pick up on more of that next time when we look at electricity, computers, and blues. That'll be our last class, sort of talking about right up until the modern time today. So as always, if you've got any questions, let me know. Otherwise, talk to you soon.